I said, you sound like to me, you're Jonah, when Lord said, go to Nineveh for their lost soul. He said, what he said, I hope I don't have to go in the belly of the whale. That was an encouragement for our brother.
That only happened because he ran from him.
So it doesn't run on him.
Where's he moving to?
It's northern Indiana,
Okay.
so not quite Chicago. Yeah.
But sometimes when the Lord lays it on your heart to do things, keep it on, he's got a purpose for it.
Yeah.
And and sometimes we don't want to do it, but if we, it's so hard, because sometimes our flesh will fight hard on it to not do right.
Yeah.
Did Larry live close to you?
It's about 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, so he lives down in that area?
Yeah, down in Prince George.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna sure miss him for sure. All right, a couple of announcements before we begin. Number one, if you didn't have an opportunity to bring something Sunday for Larry, there's a table still out there and you can drop it off. And again, I know Brother Terry mentioned that I just want to personally thank you for everything you all did for Larry, and that was a blessing for him, and very well deserved. You know, I mentioned to Larry, we took him out to lunch afterwards on Sunday, and mentioned, you know, that there's not one person here that hasn't been a beneficiary of Larry's blessing, real, you know, whether it's a meal or whatever it might be. So anyway, so we're sure going to miss him, but I know the Lord will have something for him. And a couple of things, shoe boxes for Samaritan's Purse for the Operation Christmas Child. This coming Sunday will be the last Sunday to bring those in, so remember that. Also, if we could get a few of the ladies to stay after just for a few minutes. The more we get, the less time we have to be here. But anyway, just to kind of go through the boxes just for a few minutes, just to see, just to make sure everything's ready to go. If you would be able to help us with that, we'd greatly appreciate that. So again, that'll be Sunday morning. Also, Sunday school is going to begin. We've been mentioning that, but just to throw that out there again, on 11/22 at 9:30. And so keep that in mind if you would. And as has been mentioned, if you could pray for Brother Allen, and that he'll recoup here quickly. All right. Well, let's begin, and we're going to start here in chapter 31. And here as we begin, this will actually finish out our notes for the week, but also for this section. And then we'll have another group of notes next week. So when you come in, make sure and grab that new list of notes there. So again, we'll be ending here in chapter 31 tonight. Also, we put these review questions for the whole section on there. And there's no blanks there, and all the answers are there. But more so if you just could go over on your own. So keep those in mind if you would. And as we mentioned from time to time, we encourage you to keep these, and then as you go through them or want to go back through a study, maybe on your own devotional, you can have them to go through as you study through. So just a thought there. All right, well, let's jump into chapter 31 here, and as we begin, just as a recap, just briefly, chapter 29 and 30 we went through last week, and in chapter 29 it was talking about basically answering the false charges of Eliphaz, and then chapter 30, Job's 8th answer, believe it or not. And here he's going into talking about how good he had it before, but then in chapter 30, he's talking about basically his present condition. And then here we come into chapter 31, and 31 is not just a woe is me chapter. It's actually very interesting. Actually, I have a lot of side notes here just to interject as we go through that to bring out here. A lot of things to be able to As we mentioned from time to time throughout this study, Job's so relatable, isn't he? Because not that we've gone through everything that Job has, but in the sense that a lot of the thoughts that Job has at times, sometimes we have those same thoughts, and the wondering why, and those types of thoughts that we might have even of God. And sometimes we think, oh, we can't say that, but sometimes we do wonder what God's doing in our lives. And I don't think there's anything wrong with wondering, because it's there, it's natural. But at the end of the day, we have to come back to the reality that God still is in control, that he's still watching after us. And so here in chapter 31, let's begin, and we'll read down there in your notes. Again, it begins there in the last page with I assume it's the last page of yours. It begins with number 8. One last time here, Job maintains his integrity. So let's begin in verse 1, and he says, I made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a maid? For what portion of God is there from above? And what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked and a strange punishment to workers of iniquity? And let's, hang on, in verse 4 too. Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? And here, let's look at verse 1 where he starts off, and it's kind of, as in relation to what chapter 30 was saying, it's kind of almost of an astonishing verse that he would start off with in verse 1. But he says, I have made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? So let's pause there for a moment. As we're going through each one of these chapters, and as the accusations fly from all of his friends that are accusing Job of having to have sinned, that surely he sinned, and all these different things. And we have Eliphaz, as we mentioned earlier, going around the barn, basically not necessarily just blatantly accusing Job of particular sins, but for the reality that, hey, anybody that's sinned against God, God's going to judge them, and he kind of comes around it with a little bit of a more sedate type of wording. But here, you have, in all these verses, you have Job talking about the reality that he has not sinned, he knows he's not sinned, and so here as we come to verse 1, he's once again, I believe that it's a good thing that he's talking about this, because he's also mentioning here, in his own mind and heart, he knows all these things to be true. So here he starts off with saying, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think or look upon a maid? So he's saying it's not only that he's, in previous chapters, he's talked about how he has taken care of the poor, how that he's taken care of the widows, all these different things, how that he has not sinned. Now you come to this portion where it's actually talking about a moral issue. And here, he's saying that I have not looked on a maid or a woman sexually in my mind or in my heart. And he's saying, not only that I haven't done this, but he's saying, I made a covenant with my eyes that I would not do that. With who? Who's making the covenant to? With God. And you think about that. You think about Job. And again, going back to chapter 1 and in those first few verses where it says that he hated sin. This is who Job was. It wasn't something that, I battled with it, but, I'm still plodding along. He hated sin. And sometimes that's where we need to pause, don't we? Well, not sometimes, we do daily. We need to pause, and we need to be able to realize that we don't need to hate sin like this world hates sin, a.k.a. the goat, but we need to hate sin like God hates sin. We need to do whatever it takes to be able to rid it not only from just our lives on the surface, but as Job is saying, even in my mind. Because that's where it really all starts, isn't it? It starts from seeing something, And then it can go downhill from there. It can. So Job says here, right off the bat, he says, I made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a maid, or think upon a maid? Then he goes on, he says, for what portion of God is there from above, and what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not this, and notice he goes on, he's still talking about the same discussion. He says, is not destruction to the wicked, and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? So he's saying, I've made a covenant with my eyes that I'm not going to look on a maid in the wrong types of ways or sinful types of ways. And with that said, he says, for what portion of God is there from above? In verse 3, is not destruction to the wicked? He's saying, so whenever things happen that become destructive, is that not because of wickedness? And then he goes on and says, and destruction to the wicked, and verse 3, and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity. So he's getting at the point here that doesn't all these things happen to workers of iniquity? And then but he's also reminding us, but I haven't done these sins. I've made covenants to guard myself from these things. And then he says in verse 4, doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? So it's almost like not a question to the friends anymore. Here it's a question more so to God. He's asking, don't you see all my ways? Aren't you counting my steps? Don't you really see that my ways are not wicked, but my ways are actually glorifying to you? And so this is what he's getting at here. And here in verses 1 through 4, I just wrote this as a side note. Job speaks of his continued integrity and how God brings, quote-unquote, strange punishments here on the wicked, but turns to say, is God forgetting any his or he says mine, but his integrity and his honor of him? So he's saying, I've set all these safeguards in place, but are you really seeing what I'm doing ultimately for you? And sometimes we may have those same thoughts. We may have those same questions whenever maybe, and hopefully we are. Hopefully we're living our lives in integrity towards him. And yet in that, sometimes we're like, well, is God really seeing everything that I'm doing for him? And what's the answer? Absolutely he is, right? He's seeing everything. He's seeing the good, bad, and the ugly of our lives. And so his questioning here, it's because, as we mentioned in time past, and even last week we talked about it, is that we wish at times we could have just a conference with the Lord, right, verbally, and spelling out some of these things. And this, again, is a group of questions. I believe here totally, it's not necessarily geared towards talking to his friends at this moment, but he's actually talking to God himself. So here, we see in ending there in verse 4 with this thought, does he not see my ways and count all my steps? Then he goes into verse 5 where he says, if I have walked with vanity, or if my foot had hastened to deceit, then let me be weighed in an evil balance, that God may know mine integrity. So he's saying, and he's saying hypothetically here, if I had walked with vanity, and let me ask the question, and it's not rhetorical. So, would it have been very easy for Job to be vain? Would that have been an easy thing for Job to have done in his life? Absolutely. I mean, look at all that he had, right? A lot of people, I don't believe, could have been trusted with all of the possessions and everything that he had and not become vain. But yet, he wasn't vain, was he? And here, notice here again in this verse, if I have walked with vanity, or if my foot had hasted to deceit, if that was the type of lifestyle that he was living, he goes on in verse 6, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. So he's saying that His integrity then would not be up here where he knows it to be because he has been living for God. But he says if that's really how he was living, then it wouldn't be so even anymore. It would actually be towards evil. And then he goes on in verse 7 and he says, if my step had turned out of the way, and what is the way? The way is the path towards godliness. I think it's also interesting to note that in the early church, believers were not known necessarily always as Christians, but they were known as people of the way. And even in the New Testament, it's referred to at least a couple of times as people of the way. And what was the way? The way of living for God, the way of godliness. And so here, even this statement is made here where he says that God may know on integrity. If my step had turned out of the way, and my heart walked after mine eyes, and if my blood hath cleaved to my hands, then let me sow, and let another eat. Yea, let my offspring be rooted out. And now from verse 6 down through verse 12, we're going to see another grouping here of thought. And it goes on and he says, verse 9, if my heart have been deceived by a woman, or if I have laid wait at my neighbor's door, basically he's waiting for his neighbor to leave, to go to see his neighbor's wife. He says in verse 10, then let my wife grind into another, and let others bow down upon her. For this is an heinous crime, yea, it is an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For it is a fire that consumeth to destruction, and would root out all mine increase. So here, some pretty vivid wording here, but he's saying that, hey, even if, and he's going through every possible sin or scenario that anybody could ever think to bring upon him. Why? Because they're probably already thinking this anyway. And you think about even, and I jotted down a note to remind myself of this too, you think about even David. David, whenever he sinned sexually with Bathsheba, there was recourse for that, wasn't there? There was all kinds of things that came down on David. Was there forgiveness in the end by God? Absolutely. But that didn't mean that there wasn't going to be situations that happened that were beyond David's control. You had the loss of the baby died. You had infighting that then began in the family, one against the other. You had murder. You had Absalom, the situation there. It goes on and on. So I truly believe that you can sin at times, but you can't always guard what the ramifications of those sins are going to be. And so here, Job is talking here, and he talks about that. Hey, basically he's summing this up by saying that, hey, if this were a sexual sin, and I was basically having a relation with my neighbor's wife, then it would be, it's not that it's right, but he's saying here is that then let my wife be cheating with someone else. And this is what he's saying here at the end in verse 11, or verse 10 rather. But then he follows it all up in verse 11 by notice where he says, for this is a heinous crime. You think about our society today. It's nothing to in the news and everything else. It's almost like it's flaunted as far as sexual perversion. And we're not just talking about homosexuality and all these types of sins. We're talking about just, a man with another woman, or a woman with another man that's not your husband, or not your wife. I wish preachers would talk more about that type of sin as much as they do with homosexuality and lesbianism and everything else. It's just as much sin in God's eyes. And so here, we see this, and again you say, well, why in the world is Job talking about this? Where in the world did this come from? He's really following it up from verse 1, because that's where it all started. In verse 1, he starts it off by saying I made a covenant with mine eyes, why then should I think upon a maid? So he's saying, hypothetically down here in these verses, and they're in the middle of the chapter, if I had relations with them, then all these things would occur. And really, it would almost be that he had it coming. But he says there once again in verse 11, for this is a heinous crime. That wording alone speaks of how Job thinks upon sin. And you think about even whether it's sexual sins, it doesn't matter what kind of sin it is. How do we talk about sin? How do we describe sin in our own lives? How do we look at sin in our nation, in our world? Job looks at it as he describes it as a heinous crime. And I would say that any sin is a heinous crime. Why? Because it's flying in the face of a holy God. Right. Anytime we sin, whether it's a sexual sin, whether it's, and you can name the type of sin that you want to, fill in the blank. But anytime we sin, we need to remember we're sinning against our God. We can't expect the lost world to hear those words and expect them to live any differently than they are, because they're not living for God. But as God's children, those who he has redeemed, we need to remember that, hey, he purchased us from those sins with his precious blood. We've been called to a new life. We're to count those things, Paul says, as dead. So, and as Paul mentions later on in the New Testament, he asks the question at least twice, why would, in so many words, why in the world would we ever go back to those? Realizing what God has done for us, why would we ever want to return back to that filth? And so this is exactly, so why are we spending so much time on this? Because it's important. Because we need to see, just as Job is not only reminding his friends of, but he's talking, I believe, to himself, to his friends, and ultimately to God in all of these chapters here, the last couple chapters, and we'll see this going forward even from here. He's ultimately talking to God here. He says, hey, I made a covenant with my eyes, actually before you, that I'm not going to be looking on a maid in the wrong types of ways. He comes into these verses by saying that, hey, in all of these things, if I was guilty of sexual misconduct and sin, then you know what? Let it come upon my house. Let my wife be guilty of it too. Not that he's wishing that upon her, but he's just saying, I would have that coming. Why? Because he was guilty of that sin. Then it follows up here in verses, and not a side note to the verses 6 through 12. I just put this as, if he had sinned with his neighbor's wife, then he would be judged by the judges. He mentions that there. Notice in verse 11 where he says, this is a heinous crime, yea, is an iniquity to be punished by the judges. Then also with that, and his wife had all right to be with someone else because of what he had done in his sin. So here, once again, he understands that, hey, if he was guilty of it, then he should be before the judge. But did he do these sins? No. Again, it's a hypothetical. But then we come back into verses 13 and 15 go together, and it says in verse 13, if I did despair the cause of my manservant or of my maidservant when they contended with me, what then shall I do when God riseth up? And when he visiteth, what shall I answer him? Did not he that made me in the womb make him? Talking about the manservant and maidservant. And did not one fashion us in the womb? So here in this verses 13 through 15, he's basically saying that he's talking about how that he treated his own servants. And how that he treated them well. A couple thoughts here that I put under this is, if his servants had offended him or accused him, he was always willing to hear them out. And then also, what moved him to treat his servants kindly? He asked that question in this text. What is it that caused him to treat his servants kindly? And then the answer really is he had an eye towards God, both as his own judge and maker, and thus treated everyone as an equal, with the reality that they too were created in God's image. So this is why he says this in notice in verse 13, he says, if I did despise the cause of my manservant or my maidservant, and that cause there is if they had some type of some kind of squabble or some type of question with what Job had said, then basically he's saying that I would hear them out. He didn't just come and say, hey, you're my servant and, get to it. That wasn't his attitude. And then also he goes on in verse 14 and he says, what then shall I do when God riseth up? So basically he's saying, what is going to happen whenever one day I stand before God and give an account to him? And what he's realizing is, and has realized, and is dealing with even his servants, is the reality that, hey, I was created in God's image, and so were his servants. Yeah. So he was to treat them as well as God had treated him. And that's ultimately a great lesson for us, isn't it? Whenever we have, and really, and I put this down to bring up too, is this thought, is how we treat other people who were created in God's image says a lot about how we look at our God. And that's really true. Because if we just look down on everyone that we maybe don't agree with, or maybe that we think are just, nah. There's a lot of people like that we could say these days, right? But you think about that, we're all created in God's image. And I believe that ultimately Job had it right here. Hey, we're not to be, bashing other people necessarily like them. And I'm not saying, if they're doing wrong. I'm just saying, if in situations like this, where you might have a disagreement, and that can happen in the church too, right? How many churches do we know of that have been torn apart just over disagreements? But if we had treated each other like brothers and sisters in Christ, as we should, that would have all been abated, right? And that's exactly the same type of attitude that Job had even with his servants, and that's what he's getting at here, is that this is the attitude he had. And then he goes on and he says, and goes on in verses 16 down through 23 with the next section, and he says, if I have withheld the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or, and again, all these are hypotheticals, but he says, or have eaten my morsel myself alone, and the fatherless have not eaten thereof. So he's getting at here in these group of verses, these are things where, and we already know in previous chapters where he had taken care of these individuals. He spelled that out, where widows, he had helped them and helped to feed them and to clothe them and to provide for their necessities. He talks about here, even those of the poor from their desire, and have the eyes of the widow to fail. Notice verse 17 in particular, where he says, or have eaten my morsel myself alone. Basically, just kept even all of his food and all of his food goods to himself. But he goes on to say, and the fatherless have not eaten thereof. I mean, how many of us could sit in our houses having some great dinner, knowing that somebody that we knew was starving to death? I mean, how could we live with ourselves, right? And it wasn't just, man, I feel bad, and you're shamed into doing it. The difference is Job had a heart to be able to meet that need. This was his heart. So, as we mentioned earlier, when we're talking about there's not probably a lot of people in the world that could be entrusted with everything that Job had. It was given to him by God for a reason. And it wasn't just to say, oh wow, look at Job, he's the wealthiest person in the world. Job was using his resources in a great way. And he was meeting all of these needs that he's spelling out here. So even ourselves, even today, with the resources that we have, to be able to be a help, to be a blessing to others, maybe that are needy, what great opportunity we have to be able to be that blessing, just like Job was to others. And he goes on there in verse 18, he says, For from my youth he was brought up with me as with a father, and I have guided her from my mother's womb. If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, and if he were not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless when I saw my help in the gate, then what happens? What's he saying that would happen if all that were true? He says in verse 21, or verse 22, then let mine arm fall from my shoulder blade, and mine arm be broken from the bone. For destruction from God was a terror to me, and by reason of his highness I could not endure. So he's saying that, hey, if he had really treated these people like this, which had he? No, that's not true. But, again, hypotheticals. But he's saying, if I had treated individuals like this, then he's saying here, there in verse 20, verse 22, then let my arm fall from my shoulder blade, and my arm be broken from the bone. He's saying, hey, let this happen to me if this really was happening. And why would he make that type of claim, or that statement? Why would he feel that strongly that if he had let people go without food, without clothing, he talks about even with the wool for to be able to even shield from the cold, all these different necessities, because Job truly had a heart for other people. And so once again, do we have that same type of heart to be able to meet needs? Or do we just see needs as, oh, that's too bad, what's for dinner? And that type of thought. Or do we truly have a heart to be able to meet the needs of others? So he goes on and he says in verse 23, he says, for destruction from God was a terror to me. By reason of his highness I could not endure. And if I have made gold my hope, and let me ask a question, was gold truly Job's hope? No. Was he blessed by gold? Absolutely. Yeah, he was blessed by probably about everything you can imagine. But that wasn't his hope. What was his hope? God, right? God was his true hope. That's the one he was relying on, not stuff here. And so he goes on, he says, if I have made gold my hope, and have said to the fine gold, thou art my confidence, if I rejoice because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gotten much, and if I beheld, and notice this one, I love this one. I mean, it's all good, right? But notice this one in particular. If I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in the brightness, and my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth hath kissed my hand. Basically there in verse 27, he's talking about there, he says, my heart has been secretly enticed, basically by others, by talking about either bribes or things of that nature, if that were really true. And he says, or my mouth has kissed my hand. Basically, it's a prideful act, like, wow, look at me, And basically, individuals who are wealthy had rings on their fingers normally, and you can kind of get the picture. If all this was true, he goes and says, this also were an iniquity. Notice, an iniquity to be punished by the judge. For I should have denied the God that is above. What was the previous thing that he talked about that should have been judged by the judge? Sexual sin, right? In the beginning of the chapter. Now, notice, and it's interesting here, so he says, if I had made gold my hope, and then in 25, if I rejoice because my wealth was great, so these things all go together. Notice this. And if I rejoice because my wealth was great, and because my hand had gotten much. And notice verse 26. This is what I had already read it, but I want to come back and point this out. He says, and if I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in its brightness. Think about this. So he's saying, if I had made gold my treasure, not God, and if, as he's saying here, and if I beheld the sun, as he's walking through the day, and as he beholds the sun, or the moon at night, which makes all mankind, basically there's no reason given then for them to be able to say there is no creator. And he's saying, if I can walk by and see the sun, or at night, if I can go by and see the moon, and yet he goes on down into verse 28, or verse 27, he says, and my heart has been secretly enticed, or my mouth has kissed my hand, then this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge. So he's saying here, if all these things have become treasures to me, and God's no longer my treasure, if I could walk by the sun or walk by the moon and not give any thought to God, and that God is the one who's created my world, He's allowed me to have had everything that I had, then he says this in verse 28 again, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, for I should have denied the God that is above. And that's really true. And what does that say for us? When we go about our day, the things that God has given to us, do we go by just, wow, look at all that I've got? It reminded me when I was going through this chapter, thinking about the rich young ruler in the New Testament, the individual there that died and went to hell. He had amassed everything there was, and yet died and went to hell. So what is the takeaway here in these verses for us? We need to be able to realize that, hey, God is the one that gives us everything that we have. If we can go through any day walking by with just realizing, hey, the sun's up there, and who created that sun? God. If we can go and when we had the full moon out, just was a week or so ago, every night, Kaylee Addie would want to. She said, moon, we want to go out and see the moon, and take her on the front porch and sit out there and let her see it. And I actually had a camera. I'm surprised it would, but anyway, it actually takes great pictures of the moon. You can show her all the craters, and she thought that was the neatest thing to sit out there. But if we can walk by and see the moon, and see the sun, and not realize, wow, spend the time to be able to realize that, hey, God is the God of that sun and that moon. Amen. He's the creator of all. Then he says, he comes to the conclusion here again in verse 28. This also were an iniquity. Why is it an iniquity or a sin? Because we're not giving God his just due. If we can go throughout our day and not praise the Lord for who he is, for everything that he's done for us in that day, then shame on us, and we are to be judged. And he goes on at the end of the verse. For I should have denied, notice the wording here. He says, for I should have denied the God that is above. Basically what he's saying is, I'm no better than the heathen. If I can go throughout my day without realizing that, hey, gold and silver and my possessions mean nothing in relationship to a holy God that I serve, and I can go throughout my day without noticing the sun or the moon and not giving him glory for that, then basically, as it says here at the end, then I basically denied God his just due. And shame on me. And that's true to be said of us too, even today. If we can go throughout our day and not give God his just due, and not thank God, we're so quick, right, to I've got this going on and this going on, and the wish list. But how often are we thanking him for what he does for us? That's the key. And Job realizes that. Again, these are all hypotheticals. But notice it's great realities here for us too, right? And notice he goes on in verse 29, and if I rejoice at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him, notice the wording, If I rejoice at the destruction of him that hated me, sometimes, when you see people, that maybe you were at odds with, or maybe some things of that nature, and then all of a sudden you see something bad happen to them, do we have the attitude like, kind of had it coming, that type of attitude? That's basically what he's saying here. He says, or lifted up myself when evil found him. Basically thinking, oh, I'm pretty righteous because evil found him. He was accusing me of evil, but evil found him. But was that Job's attitude? No. Why? Just like he had talked about earlier with his servants, he realized, hey, God's created us equal, and hey, I could be the one falling into sin. And once again, we have to remind ourselves, had Job sinned to allow all these things to happen to him? No. But he's reminding himself, it could have been that case though. And the shoe could have been on the other foot. So once again, it wasn't his attitude. In verse 30, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse to his soul. He's never done that. Verse 31, if the men of my tabernacle said not, oh, that we had of his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened my doors to the traveler. Once again, reminding the reader of how that he wasn't selfish. He actually even opened up his house to allow strangers to come in that needed a place to stay. Verse 32. Verse 33, if I covered my transgressions or my sins as Adam did, by hiding my iniquity in my bosom, did I fear a great multitude, or did the contempt of families terrify me, that I kept silence and went not out of the door? So what's he talking about here? He's basically saying, if he had sinned, was he so fearful that mankind would notice his sin that he basically kept himself in his own house and to be able to protect his quote-unquote integrity? But did that happen? No. It wasn't. He's giving all these hypotheticals. And verse 34, did I fear a great multitude, or did the contempt of families terrify me, that I kept silence and went not out of the door? The answer is no. Verse 35, oh, that one would hear me. And who's not hearing him up to this point? Well, his friends aren't hearing him, right? They think he's sinned. In his own mind, God's not hearing him. So he thinks that ultimately no one's hearing his pleas. So he says, oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that my adversary had written a book. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him the number of my steps. As a prince would I go near unto him. If my land cry, well, hang on, let's pause there. Notice verse 37. And this is an important verse for us to remember. Verse 37, I would declare to him the number of my steps. Who's he talking to here? He's talking to God, and he says, and as a prince would I go near unto him. That's an important statement, because that's basically how we can approach God. We don't have to come, we should come before him humbly, absolutely. But you think about that. Job hit the nail on the head there. That's exactly who we are to God. We are princes, and if you will, and princesses, and if you will, to God. Why? Because we are the king's children. And Job hit the nail on the head, didn't he? He knew that, hey, I don't have to come cowering on the floor to God, but I'm his child. I'm a prince to my God. What a beautiful picture that is, isn't it? That's exactly who we are to Jesus Christ. And then it goes on, and he says there in verse 36, surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it to a crown. He talks about being a prince there in verse 37 and verse 38. If my land cry against me, or that the furrows likewise thereof complain. Basically, nothing's growing in his fields. And if I have eaten the fruits thereof without money, or have caused the owners thereof to lose their life, and basically that he's eating fruit or his food without money or not paying for it, or have caused the owners of that property, and it leans to, most theologians believe in this, that he had actually kind of land leased some of his property, when he had a lot of property, to individuals to be able to farm and be able to glean some of those produce and whatnot for their own. So this is what he's dealing with here. And he says, if I have eaten the fruits thereof without money, or have caused the owners thereof to lose their life. Then he says in verse 40, let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle instead of barley, and the words of Job are ended. So he comes to the conclusion here at the end of this chapter, that basically he summarizes it by this. If any of these things are true, from verse 1 down here to verse 39, then he ends it in verse 40, then let thistles grow on his land where there should be wheat, and where there should be barley, let the cockle grow instead of barley, and the words of Job are ended. Basically, just let me die. And that's when he comes to the conclusion. But, once again, were any of these things true? No, they're not. So once again, we come to another chapter, the ending of another chapter, where Job has a lot of this right, doesn't he? We see through many verses in this chapter where he's purposed before God. He gets it right. We see that he's being very careful, even in his integrity, even how he looks at women, or doesn't look at women. And even in his mind, we see where he is, and how he's being cautious, and not just cautious, but he's made covenants with God that, hey, I'm not going to look at women this way. Then we come down to various verses where he talks about, hey, if I had allowed gold and silver and all these different possessions, and not being able to see the moon and the sun is from you, then he's saying basically I should be judged because basically I've neglected you. So we see through all these verses, Job has it right. What he just doesn't know, which we know as third party reading the story, is that all this has been given for a reason. And ultimately, Job will see it's for God's glory. And to be able to, for everyone to see, Job number 1, and then even the readers and his family, to be able to understand in the end that, hey, God is in complete control. It sure doesn't look like it in Job's life. Job doesn't think that way right now. And you think about our lives right now, think about our nation right now. It sure doesn't look like everything's in control, does it? But he is. And he's still on the throne. And so what a blessing it is. You know, and again, as we go through these verses, and as we see these truths that just blare out at us, we don't need to just say, hey, wow, that's a neat, that's a neat verse. We need to claim those for our very own. We need to be able to understand, hey, these verses aren't just for Job and for just a casual reader, but as a believer, we need to be delving into these verses and applying these truths to our lives. And so once again, as we continue to go through this, and we'll continue there in chapter 32 next week, and as I mentioned too, we'll have another group of another outline there for you next week. But once again, keep remembering as we go along through this, and it seems so kind of bleak at this point in a sense. But we have to keep coming back to the reality that, hey, God is still working. And even though Job doesn't think that's the case, he genuinely is. And so, anyway, so keep this thing before you, if you would, and as we continue to go through it, I pray that the Lord will continue to speak to our hearts, as we continue. Yes?
Pastor, what is cockle?
What?
What is cockle?
Cockle, it was a type of grain back in the day. So,
Okay.
yeah, along that line, so, that they would plant. Yeah. Any other questions basically worthless. Yeah,
That's why I wanted to make sure that I wasn't thinking about what he was saying.
right.
I got one thing to say, I just thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
Since you started this Job thing, since it started way back there, we didn't know, you said you probably won't go through what Job's going through, but you will go through some things, and we've been through some things since then.
Yeah.
But you couldn't even walk.
Yeah, right.
I mean, other things, not on you, others too, but I'm just saying, even in your life, you couldn't even get in here to talk to us about it.
Yeah.
But
And you think about what all's transpired since we started the series. I mean, COVID. I mean, it goes on and on and on, right? And so little did we all know how applicable it was going to become. But anyway, great story, right? And there's again a lot of application here, you know. And that I was thinking about that today as I was continuing to go through looking at this particular chapter. The thought hit me too is it can become so easy for us just to go through the story of Job with just as a third person and saying, you know, hope he gets it, without realizing that the book is not just for Job. Job put it out there, and the book's written, yes, but it's more so for us. It's more so even for the reader today, to be able to realize, hey, all these things are happening. And in our lives, there's some things that are beyond our control. We don't have any control over them. Just like in Job's life. But we still have to come back to the reality, once again, that God is in control. Whether we see it visually or not, that he genuinely is. And he's constantly working, as we say, for our good and for his glory. And sometimes it might be easier to say than to live out, but it still doesn't mean that it's not true.
So it's a lot in it, like you taking and pulling a lot out of stuff to take your time. A lot of people just take it, Job lost all his stuff and all.
Mm-hmm.
And
And he
just
got it back.
real quick. Yeah, I mean, they don't,
Yeah.
but it's a lot into that thing if you take time and study it like you showing us and trying to help us with it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, if you just come into the story with saying, you know, oh, we got it back, you skip to the end, and it ended up okay, then you miss all of the blessing. It doesn't seem like blessing right now, but the blessing of realizing that, hey, Job, all throughout this whole book, he's constantly talking to himself. Seems kind of, you know, maybe at times, but he's talking to himself in that, hey, I'm not sinning. I'm actually living my life for God. Sometimes we may have to do that, you know, not maybe down on the street corner, but we've got to talk to ourselves at times, reiterating the point that, hey, who am I genuinely living for? Am I living for myself? Or am I living for my God, ultimately, right? Well, let's close the word of prayer here as we end tonight. Father, we just come before you, and we're just thankful for our time together tonight. We're thankful, Father, for your word and the truths of your word. I pray, dear Father, as we continue through this study, that you continue to work in our hearts. Show us, dear Father, what you have for us. Not just in the surface of the story of Job, but even as we get through these verses and as we see how that we can truly apply these truths to our lives today, I pray you'd help us to do that. I pray, dear Father, that you'd help us to realize that these chapters, your Father, are not just for a casual reader, but they're actually for us to learn by. And so we just pray for each one that came out tonight. We just pray the blessings upon them and just their faithfulness. I pray, dear Father, for those who couldn't be with us tonight, that you continue just to raise them up. So many needs, dear Father, in our bulletin. Sometimes it can become overwhelming and burdensome as far as just realizing how many needs there are. But we're thankful that how that we have a God that looks at each one as if they were the only need. How that you care for each one as if it was the only need. We're thankful for that. How that we have the opportunity to be able to bring them before you. I pray, dear Father, that even in bringing all the needs before you, that as we mentioned tonight, that you'd help us to be ever so mindful to also praise you, dear God, for what you are doing in our lives. You raise us up every morning to be able to for a purpose, and that's to please and glorify you. And I pray you'd help us to be faithful in doing so with the days you give to us. We ask ask these things in Jesus' name.
Does that little thing there, does people pick up on television?
On Facebook.
Oh, okay. But so as people, sometimes they can pick us up while you having a lesson, they're not here with us, but they're at home somewhere.